Through this course, you may have noticed that some slideshows and readings featured human remains while others did not, and that I gave warnings and offered alternatives for the ones that did. This is because different cultures approached death and human remains in different ways. In the Near East during the Neolithic Age, the dead were typically interred under households, then exhumed so that the clean skull could be displayed in the household for visitors to see. Because viewing the remains of the dead was a celebrated practice, I was comfortable showing images of human remains from that culture to you. However, many cultures believe that disrupting human remains will disrupt the journey of that person's spirit or soul. Maya people, for example, seem to have left their dead buried, and for that reason I did not show images of them from the classic period or as victims of Aztec sacrifice practices. I also show human remains on some lectures because I realize that many of you taking the class may be interested in them and may even want to pursue a career that deals with human remains. While I don't work with them myself due to my cultural beliefs, I don't want to deprive you of the opportunity to see them. For those who do not want to see them, I have made sure not to include them on the cultures that would not want them shown and to provide alternatives. Archaeologists are becoming more attuned to the idea of honoring the wishes of the dead, whether they passed away yesterday or 3,000 years ago. Many North American indigenous cultures feel very strongly that the dead should remain undisturbed once buried. However, historically this wish was widely disregarded by academics and developers. Biologists would often search for indigenous cemeteries in order to dig up bodies, and academics of all branches would even visit battlefields and massacre sites to take native heads for their collection before relatives could come and claim and bury the bodies. This gruesome practice was not for medical advancement, but usually it was to prove pseudoscientific claims about the superiority of people of European descent over those of Native American or African descent. I should add, though, that the idea of race itself is socially constructed, as there is more genetic diversity within the racial categories we know than between them. During the late 1800s, those who tried to relate skull shape to moral and intellectual superiority, phrenologists, also determined that the Irish were non-white. This had far more to do with the dire economic condition and cultural side effects of extreme poverty that the Irish were experiencing than any real scientific data about their origins. To further these unscientific claims in phrenology, skulls were collected with incredibly unethical means. As mentioned before, they were taken from massacre sites, but they were also dug up from legal grave sites, and for the poor who died in hospitals, their family were often pressured to donate their bodies to pay off the debt that the hospital stay and medications had built up. In the case of Native Americans, the fact that these are the original inhabitants of the continent further complicates the legal standing, since there are many unmarked grave sites across the United States that were formed before the United States was a legal entity. This meant that for many centuries, any person who dug up Native American bodies in an unmarked location could keep those bones for any purpose. To address this problem, in 1990 the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act was passed, or Nagpra. The act requires that construction halt when human remains are found, that the tribal group related to those remains be contacted, and a respectful solution be found. Often the remains are relocated or an alternative construction plan is created. The act also states that all museums and institutions that receive federal funding are obligated to give back human remains as well as funeral objects that they took, even if taken many years ago, to the descendants. In practice, this is sometimes difficult because some bones are simply marked American Indian with no information about where they were found, who donated them, or what items came along with them. The scientists who collected them were only concerned with broad racial designations. Furthermore, many skeletons were actually taken apart, with the result that some museums simply have a box of femurs, a box of ulnas, and so forth. There are some gaps in the Nagpra law. As stated, museums only have to comply if they receive federal funding, which means many private universities are exempt. The Smithsonian is expressly exempt in the act, though it has repatriated some remains due to increasing pressure within the discipline to act in an ethical manner. And private land is still exempt. This means that if remains are uncovered on private land, the owner can keep them or sell them. However, the respectful thing to do would be to reach out to find the most closely related descendants of the person uncovered. Some landowners are hesitant to do this, thinking that it somehow jeopardizes their legal title to their land, but it does not. So how is Nagpra working? Well, it has stopped the collection of native remains, and many ancestors have been returned home. Some of these ancestors are known to their descendants by name. Some even have living direct descendants, grandchildren, who are finally able to bury their grandparents. Many native nations have created new ceremonies for reburial. Nagpra has shifted archaeological ethics as well. Some museums have worked very hard to repatriate the remains they have, doing historical research to find where they came from and going beyond what the law requires. Others have been less helpful and are notorious for claiming to have less information than they actually do, a tactic that means they can hold on to the remains for longer. If you're curious what the remains are being used for now since the age of phrenology is past, the answer is typically nothing at all. Most are not even housed in the main museums, but in cardboard boxes in warehouses. A handful of geneticists are working on theories for how the Americas were originally populated, but not much other work is coming from these remains, and certainly nothing that has direct relevance or helpfulness for Native Americans today. Given that the academic use of these remains has done a lot of harm to Native Americans and hasn't produced much good for them, most archaeologists now agree that the remains should be repatriated. It's also become apparent that working with living Native groups cooperatively can produce a lot of academic gains in terms of knowledge gathering and best practices. Game wardens and hunting offices that have worked with local indigenous groups, sharing knowledge about ecosystems, often see major improvements in how the environment is cared for. Oral tradition has even led us to shipwrecks lost for 100 years.